Back in the 1930s, a wall clock was never just a way to tell time. In homes shaped by economic collapse, rising crime, and, well, the constant expectation of sudden loss, everyday objects were pretty much always asked to do double duty. Wall clocks, especially those heavy mechanical models common in the interwar years, became, one of the most trusted hiding places for valuables, documents, and survival items. This wasn't just folklore or some clever novelty. It was a practical domestic strategy, widely understood by folks who lived through instability and planned for the worst. So what made 1930s wall clocks ideal concealment devices? Wall clocks of the 1930s were fundamentally different from modern designs. Most were built with thick wooden cases, hinged fronts, removable backs, and, honestly, some pretty generous internal cavities to house pendulums, weights, and spring-driven movements. These empty spaces weren't accidental gaps. They were structural necessities, and homeowners, well, they learned to exploit them. A clock hanging at eye level on a wall was one of the least suspicious objects in a house. Burglars moved fast, searched predictable places, and, avoided anything that looked time-consuming or fragile. A ticking clock suggested complexity and risk, which made it just about invisible to hurried hands. The clock's location also mattered. Wall clocks were usually mounted in central rooms, kitchens, hallways, or near staircases. These were places where a hiding spot would never raise suspicion because, well, the object just belonged there. Removing a clock would have required tools, time, and noise, things burglars tried real hard to avoid. For families concerned about theft, eviction, or sudden flight, this combination of concealment and accessibility was, honestly, invaluable. Inside a typical 1930s wall clock, the pendulum chamber provided the most common hiding space. Homeowners would shorten pendulums slightly or reposition them to create extra room behind the bob. Thin fabric pouches, wax paper wraps, or small tins were tied to the backboard or wedged between structural supports. These held cash, gold coins, ration books, jewelry, or folded documents. The key was weight balance. Anything stored had to be light enough not to disrupt the clock's operation. A stopped clock attracted attention. A functioning clock reassured everyone. In spring-driven clocks, the upper movement cavity often had unused side space next to the gear assemblies. Skilled owners learned exactly where a rolled document or flat packet could sit without touching moving parts. Some clocks were subtly modified by carpenters to include false wooden panels or sliding compartments that blended seamlessly into the interior case. These were not decorative features. They were survival adaptations, often passed down quietly within families. The 1930s were defined by financial precarity. Banks failed, foreclosures were common, and trust in institutions collapsed. Families learned quickly that keeping all assets in one place was dangerous. Wall clocks became decentralization tools inside the home. Important papers such as deeds, birth certificates, military records, and insurance documents were hidden in clocks because they needed protection from both theft and fire. Clock cases, especially hardwood ones, provided more insulation from heat than drawers or boxes. Cash was stored in small denominations, carefully folded to avoid bulk. Gold coins and silver certificates were favored because of their compact value. Jewelry was less common because it rattled and added weight. Silence mattered. Anything hidden inside a clock had to remain completely undetectable during normal operation. Wall clock storage rarely stood alone. It was part of a layered approach to concealment. Families spread valuables across multiple mundane objects. A clock might hold documents, while pantry tins held cash and sewing kits hid jewelry. This reduced total loss if one hiding place was discovered. The clock's role was usually reserved for the most irreplaceable items. The logic was simple. A thief might overturn furniture, empty drawers, and check mattresses. He would not dismantle a clock unless he already suspected it. This strategy was also used in rural homes where travel to banks or town centers was infrequent. Farmers and homesteaders relied on domestic concealment because distance and isolation made recovery impossible after theft. A clock offered daily access without drawing attention, allowing items to be retrieved or rotated discreetly. The principle behind clock storage, well, it still holds up today. Effective concealment relies on blending in, not just being clever. Modern homes, they're packed with those obvious hiding places that thieves already expect. The lesson from the 1930s is pretty straightforward. Use functional objects that no one would ever question or bother to take apart, even under pressure. Now, antique mechanical clocks, sure, they're collectibles these days, but the idea works for any object that folks use every day, has a bit of space inside, and seems too delicate to mess with. These days, a modern survivalist might take this idea and use, say, non-electronic wall clocks, radios, or even old metronomes that still run mechanically. The critical factors, though, they're unchanged. The object has to fit right in, be something you use daily, and most importantly, never catch attention by not working right. The clock must work. That rule has not changed. For those working with authentic 1930s clocks, preservation and discretion matter. Any storage adaptation should be reversible and non-destructive. Use soft materials that do not off-gas or degrade the wood, and avoid metal containers that could shift or vibrate. Test the clock after adding storage and observe it for several days to ensure accuracy and silence. The goal is invisibility, not capacity. So this approach can be used for safeguarding documents, emergency cache, backup data storage on non-digital media, or even those heirloom items that really shouldn't be exposed to modern safes or centralized storage. The clock, well, it becomes a passive guardian, just doing what it's always done while quietly protecting what matters most. What really separated wall clocks from those failed concealment methods was, honestly, psychology. Thieves, searched where they expected value. Clocks suggested order, routine, and normalcy. Folks associated them with timekeeping, not wealth. Even during the Great Depression, when desperation drove crime upward, the mental map of a burglar rarely included the household clock. That blind spot is what made clocks effective. The same principle explains why these methods worked across decades and regions. They relied on human behavior, not clever construction. When concealment aligns with expectation, it disappears. Understanding how ordinary people adapted everyday objects for survival reveals more about the 1930s than any headline statistic. Wall clocks as storage devices show how deeply insecurity shaped domestic life. They demonstrate quiet ingenuity, not panic. These were not tricks. They were rational responses to unstable systems. For historians and survivalists alike, this knowledge matters because it teaches how function, environment, and human behavior intersect. It reminds us that survival strategies are often hidden in plain sight, embedded in the routines people trusted most. If this kind of grounded, practical history is what you came here for, make sure you subscribe to Battlefield of Survival. Share this guide with others who value real historical knowledge that still applies today. These lessons only stay alive if we keep passing them on.